You know, when you see a massive structure like a bridge or a skyscraper,
Yeah.
it's pretty impressive.
Oh, absolutely. Feats of engineering.
But have you ever stopped to think about what's going on beneath the surface, like with all the underground work that goes into it?
It's a whole other world down there, isn't it?
It is, and it can be incredibly complex.
Way more than people realize.
Today, we're going deep, really deep into that hidden world.
Okay. I'm ready to dig in.
We're taking a look at a pretty important document in the world of underground construction, and that's the FIDIC Emerald Book, the 2019 edition specifically.
FIDIC, yeah. The International Federation of Consulting Engineers. Their contracts are pretty much the gold standard for international construction projects.
That's exactly right. So FIDIC stands for Fédération Internationale des Ingénieurs Conseils. That's the French name, of course. And their contracts set out a framework for managing these often incredibly complex projects, especially underground ones.
Where things can get a little unpredictable, shall we say.
To say the least. We've got a bunch of really insightful sources for this deep dive, and they all highlight how crucial those international standards are for dealing with the challenges of underground work.
You need that common ground, that shared language, to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with something as unpredictable as what's happening underground.
Exactly. We're going to be pulling out some key insights from the Emerald Book.
All right, let's get to it then. What are we looking at specifically?
Well, we'll definitely be digging into some of its core principles.
Those are important for sure. Kind of like setting the ground rules for the whole contract.
Exactly. But we're also going to be looking at how the Emerald Book tackles the unique issues that pop up when you're dealing with underground contracts. You know, stuff that you just don't encounter on a typical surface level project.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, think about it. When you're building a tunnel, for instance, you're not just laying a foundation on stable ground.
Yeah, you're going right through it.
Exactly. You're dealing with all sorts of unpredictable geological conditions.
You could hit a pocket of soft soil or a rock formation that's harder than you anticipated.
Exactly. And that can throw a real wrench in the works, both in terms of time and budget. So we're going to see how the Emerald Book helps manage those risks.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's get started then.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Emerald Book, though, there's another organization that plays a huge role in the world of underground construction that we should probably touch on.
Oh, you mean the ITA?
You got it. The International Tunneling and Underground Space Association.
Those guys are doing some seriously cool stuff. They're not just about digging holes. They're thinking about how we can use underground space in new and innovative ways.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Underground space is a resource, right?
It is, and it's often overlooked.
Exactly. And the ITA is really pushing to make people see the potential down there.
I mean, it's not just about tunnels for transportation or mining anymore. They're looking at things like underground storage, even urban agriculture.
It's pretty amazing, right?
It is. I think they're onto something.
I do too. Their mission is to promote the use of underground space for the benefit of society, the environment, and sustainable development.
It's a big goal.
It is. But they're making some real progress. They encourage the study of underground alternatives to above-ground construction.
That makes a lot of sense, right?
Oh, totally. I mean, you can save a lot of surface space by going underground. Plus, you can reduce the impact on the environment and even take advantage of natural resources like geothermal energy.
Plus, underground structures are inherently more resilient to things like extreme weather events or even,
Yeah.
well, you know.
Yeah. It's something a lot of people are thinking about these days.
That's definitely worth considering.
Absolutely. And the ITA helps guide public strategy. They develop guidelines for governments and public bodies on how to best utilize their underground space.
So they're not just promoting the idea, they're providing the tools to actually make it happen.
Exactly. They also arrange for the international exchange of information on underground technology.
So you've got experts from all over the world sharing their knowledge and experience. That's got to be incredibly valuable.
It is. They've got all sorts of working groups.
Oh, yeah, I read about those.
There's one specifically focused on contractual practices.
Which is, of course, very relevant to our conversation today.
It is. They're also doing a lot of work on operational safety.
Yeah, their ITA COSEF committee focuses on that.
It all adds up to a pretty impressive effort to make underground construction not only possible, but also safe and sustainable.
I'm impressed. It sounds like they're really covering all the bases.
All right, so with all that in mind, let's jump into the Emerald Book itself.
Okay, I'm ready. Where do we start?
Right at the beginning, Clause 1.1. the definitions.
Definitions. That sounds a little dry.
I know, but trust me, it's important. We need to be on the same page about what all these terms mean, especially when we're talking about something as complex as underground construction.
All right, you've convinced me. Lay it on me.
Okay, first up, we have the Geotechnical Data Report, also known as the GDR.
Ah, the GDR. That's essentially all the information the employer has gathered about the ground conditions at the site, right?
Exactly. It's like a geological survey. It includes things like the type of soil, the rock formations, the water table, you name it.
It's the baseline, the starting point for understanding what you're dealing with when you start digging.
Exactly. And it's a key document for both the employer and the contractor. The employer has to provide the contractor with the GDR.
Of course, they need to know what they're getting into.
Right. And the contractor needs to use that information to plan their work and assess the risks involved.
Now, what about the underground works themselves? How does the Emerald Book define that?
Well, it's any work that takes place, underground, but it specifically excludes shallow excavation for surface work.
Okay, so we're not talking about digging a ditch for a pipeline.
No, this is about serious underground construction. Tunnels, caverns, deep shafts, stuff that goes deep.
That makes sense. The deeper you go, the more challenging and complex it gets.
Mm-hmm. And the more important it is to have clear contract terms, especially when it comes to things that might not be anticipated.
Which brings us to unforeseeable, I presume.
You got it.
That's a word you hear a lot in construction, especially in underground work. But what exactly does it mean in the context of the Emerald Book?
Well, it refers to physical conditions encountered during the work that could not have been reasonably foreseen by an experienced contractor.
Okay, so even if a contractor does their due diligence, looks at the site investigation reports, there are still some things they just can't predict.
Right, like maybe they hit a pocket of unstable ground that wasn't detected in the initial surveys.
Or they encounter a hidden fault line, or some ancient buried structure nobody knew about.
Things like that can happen, and that's where the definition of unforeseeable comes in. Because if something truly is unforeseen, it has implications for who bears the risk and the cost.
So if it's deemed unforeseeable, the contractor wouldn't necessarily be on the hook for the delays or cost overruns.
Exactly, but it has to be genuinely unforeseen, not something that they should have reasonably anticipated based on the information they were given.
Makes sense. That kind of ties in with the geotechnical data report, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The contractor is expected to use that information to the best of their ability.
Exactly. Speaking of which, there's a whole clause about that. Clause 4.N0.3, use the geotechnical data report. It says the contractor is obligated to use the information in the GDR to plan and execute their work.
So they can't just ignore it and then claim everything was unforeseen.
Exactly. And the employer is obligated to provide that data to the contractor before the project begins.
That's in clause 2.5. The employer has to be transparent about what they know about the site conditions.
That's right. Now, there's a really important nuance here. Subclause 4.10.1 generally says that the contractor is responsible for their own interpretation of the data in the GDR.
So even though the employer provides the information, the contractor has to use their expertise to analyze it and draw their own conclusions.
Right. They're the construction professionals, after all.
Right. But there's an exception to that, right?
Yeah. There's this other thing called the Geotechnical Baseline Report, or the GBR. That report basically interprets the raw data in the GDR.
So it's like an expert analysis of the ground conditions.
Exactly. And the contractor is not responsible for interpreting the GBR itself. The GBR sets the baseline for what's expected, and the contractor's performance is judged against that baseline.
I see. So the GBR kind of sets the boundaries for what's considered foreseeable and unforeseeable.
Precisely. If the conditions encountered fall within the GBR, they're usually handled under a different clause, subclause 13.8, which deals with the measurement of excavation and lining work.
Oh, so there are different mechanisms for dealing with expected versus unexpected conditions.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a much more nuanced approach than just saying unforeseen equals contractor's problem.
Oh, for sure. This way, the risks and responsibilities are allocated more fairly based on what was known or could have been known beforehand.
Okay, so we've talked about definitions. We've touched on some clauses related to site information and unforeseen conditions. What else is there?
Well, in construction, change is inevitable.
Oh, tell me about it. No project ever goes exactly according to plan.
Especially not underground. So that's where the concept of variations comes in.
Okay, so a variation is basically any change to the original scope of work.
Exactly. It could be a change in design, a change in materials, a change in the method of construction, anything, really.
And those changes can come up for all sorts of reasons, I imagine.
Oh, yeah, especially in underground work. You could uncover something unexpected during excavation that requires a design change.
Or maybe the client decides they want to add a new feature or modify an existing one.
Exactly. And that's where Clause 13 comes in, variations and adjustments. It lays out the process for how those changes are handled.
So it's basically the rule book for dealing with changes to the project.
That's a good way to put it. Now, the engineer has the authority to initiate variations.
The engineer, right? They're kind of like the referee in all this.
Exactly. They're an independent third party who makes sure the contract is being followed.
So they can decide that a change is necessary and instruct the contractor to make it.
That's right. That's called a variation by instruction. It's covered in subclause 13.3.1.
And what about if the contractor thinks a change is necessary?
Well, they can submit a proposal to the engineer.
And that's called a variation by request for proposal, right?
Yeah. Subclause 13.3.2. The engineer then reviews the proposal and decides whether to approve it.
So it's a collaborative process. The engineer doesn't just dictate changes, they consider input from the contractor as well.
Exactly. It's all about finding the best solution for the project as a whole.
So what happens if a variation is approved? How is that factored into the contract?
Well, any change to the scope of work can have an impact on the cost and the timeline.
Of course it makes sense. More work, more time, more money.
Right. So the Emerald Book lays out procedures for valuing those variations and adjusting the contract accordingly.
So it's not just a matter of saying, okay, we're doing this extra thing now. It's all properly documented and accounted for.
Exactly. It's important to maintain that transparency and accountability throughout the project.
Okay. What else is in Clause 13?
Well, there's this thing called provisional sums.
Provisional sums, what are those?
It's basically an amount of money set aside in the contract for work that hasn't been fully defined yet.
So it's kind of like a placeholder for future costs that are anticipated but not yet detailed.
Exactly. You know, sometimes you can't specify everything up front, especially in underground work.
Yeah, they're always unknowns.
Right. So the provisional sums give the project a bit of flexibility to deal with those unknowns as they arise.
It's like having a contingency fund for unforeseen issues or changes in scope.
That's a good way to think about it.
And what about changes that are completely outside of the project team's control, like changes in laws or regulations?
That's addressed too. Clause 13.6, adjustments for changes in laws.
Makes sense. Laws can change during the course of a project, especially a long one.
Right. So the Emerald Book provides a mechanism for adjusting the contract to reflect those changes.
So it's all about keeping the contract up to date and relevant to the current legal environment.
Precisely. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about time.
Time is money, as they say.
Especially in construction. So Clause 8 of the Emerald Book deals with commencement, delays, and suspension.
It's all about keeping the project on schedule.
Exactly. The contract will specify a time for completion, which is the date by which the contractor is obligated to finish the work.
Okay, and I'm guessing that's defined in Clause 1.1, along with all those other important terms.
You know it. Clause 1.1.3 to be precise.
So what happens if the project gets delayed?
Well, that's where things get interesting. The contractor might be entitled to an extension of time for completion.
So they get more time to finish the project without being penalized.
Exactly. That's covered in Clause 8.5.
But there must be valid reasons for a time extension, right? They can't just ask for more time because they feel like it.
Right. The delay has to be caused by something that's not the contractor's fault.
Like what?
Well, those unforeseeable physical conditions we talked about earlier could be one reason.
Oh, right. Those unexpected ground conditions that nobody could have predicted.
Exactly. Or it could be a delay caused by the employer, like maybe they're late in providing necessary information or approvals.
And those kinds of delays are specifically addressed in the Emerald Book.
Absolutely. And on the flip side, if the contractor is late and it's their fault, they might have to pay delay damages.
Ah, so there are consequences for not meeting the agreed-upon deadlines.
That's right. The Emerald Book tries to create a fair balance between giving the contractor some leeway when things are genuinely outside their control, while also holding them accountable for meeting their obligations.
A two-way street, like you said.
Exactly. Now, there's this really interesting concept called advance warning in Clause 8.4.
Advance warning, what's that about?
Well, it requires the contractor to notify the employer and the engineer as soon as they become aware of any potential delay.
So before the delay even happens.
Exactly. It's about being proactive and trying to mitigate the impact of the delay.
It's like a heads up so everyone can start thinking about solutions before things get out of hand.
Exactly. And Clause 8.6 specifically addresses delays caused by authorities.
Oh, so if a government agency is slow in issuing a permit or something.
Exactly. Those kinds of delays are outside the contractor's control, so the contract provides a framework for dealing with them.
So Clause 8 is really comprehensive. It covers all sorts of scenarios related to the project timeline.
It does. Now let's talk about the worst case scenario.
You mean when things go so wrong that the project has to be terminated?
Exactly. The Emerald Book has provisions for that too. Clause 15 covers termination by the employer, and Clause 16 covers termination by the contractor.
So either party can end the contract under certain circumstances.
That's right.
What are some of the reasons an employer might terminate the contract?
Well, if the contractor is in serious breach of the contract, for instance.
Like what?
Maybe they've abandoned the work, or they're consistently failing to meet deadlines.
Or if they've become insolvent, so they're not financially able to complete the project.
Exactly. And on the flip side, the contractor might terminate the contract if the employer is in breach.
Like if they're not paying the contract to what they're owed.
That's right. Or if they're not providing the contractor with the necessary information or access to the site.
So it's a safeguard for both parties.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note that the financial consequences of termination can vary depending on who initiates it and the reasons for it.
That makes sense.
There are different clauses that lay out how the final payment to the contractor is calculated in different termination scenarios.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, it's very specific to the circumstances.
Now let's talk about disputes. They're bound to happen in any construction project, right?
Especially one as complex as an underground project.
So how does the Emerald Book deal with disagreements?
Clause 21, disputes and arbitration.
Arbitration. That's usually the way construction disputes are settled, right?
Yeah. It's a process where a neutral third party, called an arbitrator, hears both sides of the story and makes a binding decision.
Okay, so the Emerald Book sets out the rules for arbitration.
It does. But before we get to arbitration, there's usually an attempt to resolve the dispute through a dispute avoidance adjudication board or the DAAB.
So the DA just tries to prevent the dispute from going to arbitration.
That's the idea. It's a panel of experts who are appointed by both parties.
And they have the authority to decide the dispute.
They do. Their decision is usually binding, but there is a mechanism for either party to appeal if they disagree.
And that's where the Notice of Dissatisfaction, or NOD, comes in.
Exactly. If a party is unhappy with the DAB's decision, they can issue an NOD.
And that basically says, we don't accept this decision and we want to take it further.
Pretty much. It's the next step in the dispute resolution process.
So the Emerald Book provides a structured approach to resolving disputes. First, you try to avoid them altogether. Then, if a dispute arises, you try to settle it amicably through the DAA.
Exactly. And if that doesn't work, then you go to arbitration.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about definitions, unforeseen conditions, variations, time, termination, and disputes. Anything else?
One last but really important thing. The FIDA Golden Principles.
Ah, yes, those. They're like the guiding principles for any FIDA contract.
Exactly. The Emerald Book, like all other FIDA contracts, has a set of general conditions.
These are the standard terms and conditions that apply to all FIDA contracts, right?
Right. But each project also has particular conditions.
Which are specific to that project, tailoring the general conditions to the unique needs of the work.
Exactly. And the Golden Principles are meant to ensure that those particular conditions don't stray too far from the core values of FIDIC.
So they're like guardrails to prevent modifications from undermining the fundamental principles of fairness and balance that are built into the standard FIDA contracts.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so what are some of these Golden Principles?
Well, the first one, Golden Principle 1, emphasizes that the fundamental roles and responsibilities of the parties shouldn't be radically altered.
So you shouldn't try to completely rewrite who's responsible for what.
Exactly. For example, you can't modify the contract to make the engineer need the employer's approval for every decision.
Because that undermines the engineer's independence and impartiality.
Right. And Golden Principle 2 stresses the importance of clarity in the particular conditions.
No ambiguity allowed.
Exactly. It has to be crystal clear what changes are being made to the general conditions.
Otherwise, you're just asking for trouble down the line.
Exactly. And Golden Principle 3 focuses on risk allocation.
Ah, risk. That's a big one in construction.
It is. And this principle says that each risk should be allocated to the party who is best able to control it.
So the party who has the most influence over the outcome of that risk.
Exactly. For example, you can't just transfer all the risk of unforeseen ground conditions to the contractor.
Because the employer usually has more information about the site before the contract is signed.
Exactly. The risk allocation should be fair and reasonable.
And what about the last one, Golden Principle 4?
That one deals with timeframes.
So making sure the deadlines are reasonable.
Exactly. You can't set time limits that are so short that they're impossible to meet or so long that they hold up the project.
It's all about finding a balance that allows the work to progress efficiently while also giving the parties enough time to fulfill their obligations.
Exactly.
Those golden principles are pretty important, aren't they?
They are. They really help to ensure that the FIDIC contract remains a fair and balanced instrument even when it's modified for a specific project.
And that consistency is really important, especially when you're dealing with international projects.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground today, so to speak.
We have. We've delved into the depths of the FIDI Emerald Book.
We've seen how it provides a framework for managing the complex world of underground construction contracts.
We've looked at key definitions, explored clauses dealing with unforeseen conditions and variations, and examined the mechanisms for handling delays, termination, and disputes.
And we've highlighted those fundamental principles of fairness and risk allocation that underpin the entire FIDIC approach.
All in all, it's a pretty impressive document.
It is, and it plays a vital role in ensuring these complex and often challenging underground projects are executed successfully. Now, as we wrap things up, we'd like to leave you with something to think about.
A little food for thought.
Exactly. When you consider all the inherent uncertainties of working underground, all the potential for things to go differently than planned, how important do you think it is to have a clear, well-defined, and internationally recognized contract framework like the FIDIC Emerald Book?
It's a question worth pondering, especially if you're involved in any kind of project, whether it's underground or not, where there's a lot at stake.
A solid contract can be the difference between a successful project and a complete disaster.
And if this deep dive has sparked your interest, we encourage you to explore the full FIDIC Emerald Book for a deeper understanding.
There's a whole world of knowledge in there just waiting to be unearthed.
And who knows, maybe you'll even discover a passion for underground construction. It's a fascinating field full of challenges and rewards.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the FIDIC Emerald Book. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.
Happy digging.